Dr. Althea Vaughn built an empire so secret that even the government didn't know how much power she held. She trusted no one, not partners. Not politicians, not family, especially not children. So when two teenage boys showed up at her private estate during a storm, soaked, silent, and asking for nothing but one night of shelter, she should have called the police. Instead, she opened a gate. That single decision would expose a buried partnership, a staged death, and a legal clause that made those boys the majority heirs to everything she had built in secrecy. And somewhere in the shadows, the men who had been searching for them were already watching. The Atlantic wind came in hard sheets, slapping rain against the tall windows of Vaughn House, a modern fortress perched above the Maryland coast. From the highway below, the estate looked like a museum of glass and stone, lit with the calm confidence of money. Dr. Althea Vaughn moved through it without haste, her posture precise, her face unreadable. To the public, she was the rare billionaire who spoke softly, funded scholarships, and never raised her voice. Tonight the storm made that story feel thin, like paper held to fire. She listened to thunder the way others listened to prayer. Her office sat behind a biometric door, hidden past a corridor lined with contemporary art that cost more than the nearby fishing boats. Screens glowed with maps, ledgers and encrypted dashboards that tracked a second world beneath her public charities. Althea had built it through shell companies stacked like nesting dolls, data vaults mirrored across oceans, and private contracts that made governments depend on her systems without ever speaking her name. She reviewed nightly transfers with the focus of a surgeon, correcting tiny inconsistencies before they became threats. Control was her language, secrecy was her oxygen. No one entered uninvited. The discipline was learned the hard way. At 19, Althea had watched her own family sign papers that stripped her of an inheritance, then locked the door on a suitcase and a warning to never come back. She survived on borrowed couches, scholarships, and an anger that never cooled. Success became her revenge, but it also became her cage. She kept people at a respectful distance, rewarding loyalty with compensation, not closeness. Trust in her mind was a trapdoor, love was a liability that created leverage for predators. She hadn't been touched by comfort in decades. The storm agreed tonight. A muted television in the corner played local headlines, the anchor's mouth moving without sound. Captions scrolled about a shooting 2 neighborhoods over in Baltimore, about missing teens, about a city tightening into fear. Althea kept it on for pattern recognition, not empathy, yet the words still pressed at old memories of streetlights and sirens. She paused on one detail: 2 brothers reported sleeping wherever they could, last seen near a bus terminal. The image on the screen flickered, grainy and brief, but something in it tugged at her attention before she could dismiss it. Then her security console chimed. The console's alert wasn't the usual perimeter motion from deer or wind-tossed branches. It carried the red tag reserved for human presence at the outer gate. Camera feeds opened across her screens, showing 2 figures pressed against iron bars, drenched, shivering, and trying to shield their faces from the rain. They looked young, too thin for their oversized hoodies, their hands empty except for a torn plastic bag. Althea's head of security, Randall Pierce, sent a rapid stream of protocol notes: call police, deny access, document everything. Her staff waited for her nod like an execution order. She kept staring. For a long moment she studied the boys the way she studied hostile markets, searching for intent, manipulation, hidden hands. Yet their bodies told a simpler story: exhaustion, hunger, and the particular stillness of children who had learned not to ask twice. One of them stood slightly in front of the other, taking the wind first, protecting without thinking. Althea felt an unexpected irritation at her own chest, as if something old had shifted out of place. She issued a single instruction through the intercom system, authorizing temporary entry and medical checks. Randall hesitated, then complied, and the gates opened. Minutes later, the mansion's foyer held the scent of wet pavement, a foreign smell in a home meant to feel untouchable. The boys stepped onto marble that had never known bare feet. Althea watched from the mezzanine as staff offered towels and heat, and she wondered why she hadn't ordered them turned away. It wasn't mercy. It was recognition she couldn't name. Outside, the storm kept clawing at the cliffs. Inside, a chain reaction began. She didn't yet understand that this one night of shelter would drag a lineage into daylight and expose the secret empire she built to survive. By the time the storm softened into a steady coastal rain, the boys were seated in the East Wing sitting room, wrapped in neutral, toned blankets that looked foreign against their worn clothes. The fire cast a restrained glow across polished floors and curated sculptures. They did not touch anything. They did not lean back. They occupied the space like temporary shadows. From the far end of the room, Dr. Althea observed them with the same still precision she used in high-level negotiations, saying little, revealing nothing, absorbing everything. Malcolm Reed, 17, carried himself with a composure that did not belong to his age. His movements were measured, economical, almost strategic. Even seated, he positioned his body slightly forward, subtly blocking the younger boy from the broader room. His eyes did not wander with awe, they cataloged exits, cameras, and staff movement. There was calculation in him, but not arrogance. It was the posture of someone who had learned that vulnerability invited consequences. When he answered basic intake questions from staff, his vocabulary was careful and unusually structured, as if he had trained himself to sound older than his circumstances. Isaiah Reed, 15, sat closer to the fire, absorbing warmth without apology. He was more expressive in his features, though he tried to suppress it whenever Malcolm shifted beside him. His loyalty was visible in the way he deferred, waiting for silent cues before speaking. His gaze traveled more freely across the room, lingering on paintings and high ceilings, curiosity fighting caution. Around his neck hung a thin chain holding a small pendant dulled by time. He touched it occasionally, not for display but reassurance, as if it anchored him to something stable. Their background unfolded through sparse documentation. Years in the foster system, multiple relocations, a mother who had died under unclear circumstances when Isaiah was 6 and Malcolm was 8. No consistent relatives listed. No permanent address history longer than a year. The records were clean but incomplete, the kind that raised more questions than they answered. Althea absorbed the data without comment, yet something in the pattern unsettled her. She had seen fabricated identities before, she had built a few herself. The gaps were too symmetrical. Her attention returned to Malcolm. There was something else beneath the composure. A discipline in his silence, a refusal to over-explain. He did not perform gratitude. He did not ask for comfort. He accepted what was given and studied the source. It reminded her of someone she had once trusted beyond reason. The thought surfaced uninvited and retreated just as quickly. She dismissed it as projection, a mind finding patterns where none existed. Then Isaiah shifted, and the pendant slipped into clearer view. The firelight caught its surface, revealing a faint insignia etched into the metal. Althea's breath slowed by a fraction. The symbol was subtle, nearly worn away, but unmistakable to her. A triangular lattice intersected by a vertical line, an abstract mark known only to a closed circle within her most secret holding company. It was never printed publicly. It never appeared in filings. It was used internally, embedded in encrypted systems, and stamped once, years ago, onto a limited run of founder tokens. Her pulse did not rise outwardly, but internally the memory struck with surgical force. 18 years earlier, she had founded the hidden infrastructure arm of her empire with a man whose brilliance matched her own. He had believed in ethical limits, she had believed in inevitability. Their final disagreement had fractured more than partnership. He disappeared weeks later, officially lost to an accident that left no body. She had sealed the chapter, archived the grief, and hardened the edges around it. Now that insignia rested against the chest of a boy who should never have known it existed. Coincidence felt statistically absurd. Calculated placement felt equally dangerous. Althea's mind ran through probabilities in silence. If someone had orchestrated this encounter, it meant her most protected layer had been breached. If it was not orchestrated, then the implications were more destabilizing than any corporate threat. Without altering her expression, she initiated a discreet protocol through her internal system, requesting a silent genetic analysis using biometric samples gathered during medical intake. The request routed through a private channel accessible only to her. No staff notifications, no secondary oversight. The data would return within hours. The boys believed they had found temporary shelter from a storm. They did not see the shift behind her eyes. They did not know that their presence was disturbing a sealed vault of history she had sworn never to reopen. As midnight settled over the estate, her encrypted console pulsed with a quiet notification. The preliminary scan displayed an unexpected genetic overlap marker that made her blood run cold. The confirmation arrived at 20:17 a.m., silent and clinical, devoid of drama. Dr. Althea Vaughn stood alone in her private office as the encrypted genetic report finalized across her screen. The markers aligned with a probability percentage too precise to dismiss. Malcolm Reed and Isaiah Reed shared direct biological lineage with Darius Kincaid. The name settled into the room like a verdict. Her public fortune, impressive as it was, represented only a fraction of her true power. Beneath foundations and philanthropic boards lived a second architecture, encrypted data markets that sold predictive modeling to private clients, surveillance algorithms licensed through intermediary firms, silent partnerships with federal contractors who preferred influence without visibility. The infrastructure did not appear in shareholder reports. It did not answer to media scrutiny. It operated through layered shells that made tracing ownership nearly impossible. That hidden empire was known in full to only 3 people. One had died 5 years earlier from a sudden aneurysm, taking with him a third of the operational encryption keys. One had vanished 18 years ago, declared lost in a coastal accident after a boat was found empty and drifting, and one remained standing in the dim light of Vaughn House, absorbing the consequences of a past she had compressed into silence. Darius Kincaid had been more than a co-founder. He had been a mirror, reflecting both her ambition and her restraint. Brilliant, patient, ethically anchored, he believed technology should predict risk, but never predetermine human worth. In the early years, they built together with shared hunger, coding late into mornings, mapping possibilities that governments could not yet imagine. He tempered her velocity, she sharpened his reach. For a time, their alignment felt unbreakable. The fracture began when their predictive policing algorithm demonstrated alarming efficiency in identifying high-risk zones. Contracts followed quickly. Cities adopted the system. Profits multiplied. Darius saw the shadow forming beneath the success. The data, though mathematically neutral, disproportionately mapped communities already burdened by over-surveillance. He argued for limitations, safeguards, transparency clauses. Althea saw hesitation where she believed momentum was required. She insisted that influence from inside systems allowed gradual reform. He warned that unchecked power reshaped morality before reform could ever arrive. Their final private meeting ended without resolution. He accused her of building a machine that would quietly decide futures. She accused him of fearing the scale of what they could become. Weeks later, his boat was discovered adrift off the Chesapeake, his absence categorized as accidental drowning. There was no public investigation that threatened the empire. There was no evidence of foul play. Althea absorbed the loss and expanded operations with clinical efficiency. Grief was archived behind growth. Ambition proved easier to manage than regret. Now the genetic data rewrote everything. Malcolm's structured composure, Isaiah's inherited warmth, the insignia pendant, it aligned into a pattern too precise to ignore. These were not random boys caught in a storm. They were Darius's sons. The implications were not merely emotional, they were structural. Darius had retained a controlling equity clause in the hidden infrastructure arm, a clause that transferred majority ownership to direct heirs in the event of his confirmed death. 51%. A majority stake in an empire built on invisibility. If the lineage became public, the consequences would detonate across multiple layers. Corporate control would fracture. Federal contracts would invite scrutiny. Offshore entities would face exposure. Competitors would circle. Regulators would demand transparency that the architecture was never designed to withstand. Even the philanthropic foundation that bore her name could collapse under association. The empire beneath the empire had been engineered to avoid bloodline vulnerabilities. Yet blood had returned to claim it. The most destabilizing question pressed hardest: coincidence or orchestration. The boys had arrived at her gates on a night when regional violence dominated headlines, as if designed to blend into noise. Their foster records were incomplete but not suspicious enough to trigger alarms. Someone could have guided them toward her estate without revealing the hand behind it. If an external force had discovered Darius's heirs, then the perimeter breach was deeper than a simple genetic match. Power constructed in secrecy was never meant to encounter inheritance. It was designed for continuity through silence, not succession through family. Althea closed her eyes briefly, calculating outcomes the way she always had. Protect the empire or protect the truth. Consolidate control or confront legacy. Before she could finalize a strategy, her primary encrypted channel flickered. An anonymous transmission forced itself through layered firewalls, bypassing systems no outsider should penetrate. The message was brief, written in plain text against a black field. They are not the only heirs. The anonymous message did not arrive as a threat. It arrived as certainty. Dr. Althea Vaughn stood motionless in front of her encrypted console while the words lingered on the screen, as if daring her to deny their implication. They are not the only heirs. The phrasing suggested knowledge, not speculation. Whoever sent it understood the bloodline confirmation before she had spoken it aloud. That realization narrowed the field of possible adversaries to a single circle powerful enough to reach into her hidden architecture without triggering alarms. The Marrow Collective had never appeared in official documents. They operated through consultancies and private advisory firms staffed by former intelligence contractors who preferred anonymity to recognition. In the early days of her shadow infrastructure, they had provided silent seed capital in exchange for a minority stake and strategic insight into global contracts. They admired efficiency and influence. They did not care about ethics. Their involvement had been transactional, their presence deliberately distant. But distance did not mean disengagement. It meant patience. For years, they had lobbied quietly for expanded authority within the hidden network, pressing for access to predictive models that could shape geopolitical outcomes. Althea resisted incremental control shifts, guarding operational autonomy with calculated diplomacy. The collective wanted more than profit. They wanted full command. If Darius's heirs legally held majority ownership, the collective's leverage would dissolve. That made the boys more than inheritance risks. They were obstacles. Althea reopened archived communications and cross-referenced recent market anomalies. Patterns emerged where she once saw randomness. The Reed brothers had cycled through foster placements that positioned them gradually closer to the Eastern Corridor. The final relocation placed them within bus distance of her coastal estate. It no longer felt accidental. It felt curated. The collective had been searching for Darius's bloodline, and once located, they had not hidden the boys from her. They had delivered them. A new layer of surveillance footage streamed across her monitor. Earlier that evening, before the storm intensified, a black SUV had idled half a mile from the estate gates for 12 minutes, headlights off, engine running. The vehicle left moments before the perimeter alert triggered. License plate data returned inconclusive, masked through rotating registrations. The timing was too precise to ignore. She had not discovered the Heirs by chance. She had been maneuvered into discovery. Inside Von House, the air shifted subtly. Althea initiated internal audits on staff access logs, reviewing who had clearance to perimeter feeds and intake procedures. One minor discrepancy surfaced, a delay in alert routing that rerouted through a secondary server before reaching her console. It was small enough to appear technical, yet deliberate enough to imply manipulation. Betrayal, if present, was not dramatic. It was procedural. Meanwhile, Malcolm Reed began noticing changes of his own. Security personnel rotated more frequently through visible corridors. Conversation stopped when he approached. Doors that had been unlocked earlier now required keycards. He did not confront anyone, he observed. His gaze tracked camera angles and blind spots with quiet calculation. Althea saw it from the mezzanine and felt an unexpected tension. He was not RV. He understood that shelter came with conditions. The question pressing against her restraint was one she had not faced in decades. Eliminate the risk or protect the boys. In purely strategic terms, distancing herself would stabilize the empire. She could report them to authorities, sever contact, claim ignorance. The collective would lose leverage. The bloodline would drift back into obscurity. It would be efficient. It would be consistent with the principles that built her success. Yet the storm outside had quieted, and inside her misbelief began to fracture. Trust is weakness. Love is liability. The words no longer felt like armor, they felt like confession. Protecting the boys could cost her contracts, alliances, even freedom. But abandoning them would confirm the worst version of herself, the one Darius had warned about before disappearing into history. For the first time in years, her calculations included something intangible. She authorized heightened internal security while keeping the boys under her protection. It was not sentimentality, it was decision. As if in response, alarms flickered across her offshore financial dashboard. Access to one of her primary vault clusters abruptly terminated, encryption keys rejected in real time. Someone was not waiting for her to choose. Someone was already moving against her. The full DNA confirmation arrived before sunrise, layered with biometric certainty and legal implications. Dr. Althea Vaughn read the report twice, not because she doubted the science but because acceptance required repetition. Malcolm Reed and Isaiah Reed were verified biological sons of Darius Kincaid. The majority equity clause embedded 18 years earlier in encrypted partnership agreements was no longer theoretical. The heirs existed. The empire beneath her public success now had blood attached to it. She chose not to disclose the truth immediately. Instead, she invited the boys to dinner in the formal dining room, a space designed for diplomatic restraint rather than intimacy. Candlelight reflected against glass walls, and the Atlantic stretched dark beyond them. Staff moved quietly, retreating at her subtle signals. She studied the brothers as they navigated the setting with measured caution. Malcolm's posture remained precise, his eyes attentive to detail rather than decoration. Isaiah absorbed the atmosphere differently, drawn to the warmth of the space, though he kept glancing at Malcolm before reaching for anything unfamiliar. As the meal progressed, Malcolm asked controlled questions about the estate's energy systems and security redundancies, framing them as casual curiosity. His phrasing revealed more than interest, it revealed analysis. He identified inefficiencies in camera blind spots without having access to blueprints. He speculated about offshore data routing after noticing satellite arrays on the cliffside. The insights were not guesses. They were patterns assembled quickly and quietly. Althea felt the echo of Darius in the structure of Malcolm's thinking, the same disciplined intelligence that once challenged her in boardrooms and laboratories. Isaiah's attention drifted toward the personal rather than the strategic. He asked about the art lining the corridors, about the history behind certain architectural decisions, about why someone would build such a vast home overlooking open water. There was no accusation in his tone, only searching. His gaze lingered on details others ignored, and when he laughed softly at a minor observation, the sound carried a vulnerability that unsettled Althea more than Malcolm's precision. In Isaiah she saw a reflection of her younger self, before ambition hardened into armor. Memory intruded without permission. She returned to the night Darius confronted her in a private conference room overlooking the city skyline. He had presented data demonstrating that their predictive policing software disproportionately flagged neighborhoods already burdened by surveillance. He argued that profitability without recalibration would entrench inequality. She had countered with long-term strategy, insisting that influence from inside systems allowed incremental reform. He saw moral erosion where she saw expansion. The argument did not end in anger, it ended in distance. That distance widened until it swallowed him. Now the irony cut deeper than accusation. The very algorithms that amplified her empire had likely shaped the policed communities the Reed brothers survived. Reports she once reviewed as abstract metrics now felt personal. She pictured Malcolm navigating foster homes under watchful systems that labeled risk before opportunity. She imagined Isaiah growing up in zones flagged by predictive data her company supplied. The empire she built to survive betrayal may have quietly contributed to the instability that defined their childhood. Guilt surfaced not as confession but as calculation interrupted. She began reviewing legacy structures instead of quarterly projections. For the first time, she questioned whether continuity of control equaled success. If Darius's sons inherited the empire in its current form, they would inherit both power and consequence. The realization pressed against her long-held belief that survival justified structure. Later that evening, Isaiah wandered into the private library while Malcolm remained near the West Corridor security panels. Isaiah's fingers traced spines of archived documents until he paused at a framed photograph tucked between financial ledgers. The image showed a younger Althea standing beside Darius Kincaid, both leaning over a prototype server, expressions aligned in shared ambition. Isaiah studied the face of the man whose features faintly mirrored his brother's. He did not call attention to it, but something in his stillness shifted. Malcolm sensed the undercurrent. He watched Althea more closely now, noticing pauses before she answered simple questions, observing the tension beneath her controlled exterior. He understood that information was being withheld. Althea, aware of his perception, drafted a contingency. Will that evening? Restructuring ownership pathways should disclosure become unavoidable. The emotional arithmetic became unavoidable. The empire that secured her independence might have destabilized the lives of the very heirs now under her roof. Before she could finalize a course of action, the lights across Vaughn House flickered. A staged power fluctuation rippled through backup generators, and security feeds glitched for 9 critical seconds. When illumination stabilized, Isaiah was no longer in the library. The blackout lasted less than 10 seconds, but the damage unfolded in layers. When emergency lighting stabilized across Vaughn House, Althea Vaughn was already moving toward the security hub, her pulse steady despite the fracture spreading through her systems. Monitors flickered with restored feeds, yet one frame remained disturbingly incomplete. Isaiah Reed had vanished between camera rotations not through force, not through chaos, but through precision. The glitch was engineered. Her offshore dashboards began collapsing next. Encrypted vault clusters rejected her biometric credentials, routing control through secondary authorization pathways she did not recognize. Firewalls recalibrated without her command. Years of layered autonomy were dissolving in real time. The Marrow Collective was no longer signaling. They were executing. Malcolm stood at the edge of the command room, jaw set, absorbing the shift without panic. Security personnel urged him toward a secure interior suite, but he refused to move. His refusal was not loud, it was immovable. He understood instinctively that separation now meant vulnerability. Althea studied him for a long moment and recognized something she had once admired in Darius: refusal to retreat when truth demanded presence. There was no strategic value left in silence. She dismissed the remaining staff, except for 2 trusted technicians, and turned to Malcolm. Her voice remained measured, but the content carried weight she had buried for nearly 2 decades. She revealed that his father, Darius Kincaid, had co-founded the infrastructure empire beneath her public success. She explained the majority equity clause tied to direct heirs. She acknowledged that his disappearance had never felt accidental to her, though she had lacked proof. She did not offer apology, she offered fact. Malcolm absorbed the revelation without outward collapse, but something in his posture shifted. The disciplined composure faltered just enough to reveal fracture beneath it. His father was not a nameless absence lost to tragedy. He was architect, idealist, shareholder in an empire that shaped invisible forces around them. The weight of inheritance settled heavily across his silence. Questions formed behind his eyes, but he did not ask them yet. He looked toward the darkened hallway where Isaiah had last been seen, and that focus sharpened into resolve. The demand arrived through a secure channel normally reserved for federal contracts. A video transmission displayed a blurred interior space and a timestamp confirming it was live. No physical harm was shown, but Isaiah's absence required no demonstration. The Marrow Collective's message was clear and structured: transfer controlling shares of the hidden infrastructure arm immediately, authorize permanent operational oversight, and the boy would be returned unharmed. Refusal would escalate consequences. The language was clinical, almost courteous. Althea felt the full convergence of her past decisions. The Empire represented independence forged from betrayal, proof that she would never again be powerless. Relinquishing control meant dismantling the architecture she built to protect herself. Retaining it meant risking the life of a boy who carried the blood of the only partner who had ever challenged her conscience. Strategy offered multiple pathways, but none preserved both power and protection. She initiated a trace on the transmission, rerouting through satellite triangulation and maritime data feeds. The signal masked itself through rotating proxies, but latency irregularities exposed a physical origin near Norfolk's industrial waterfront. A privately leased offshore warehouse, registered under a shell corporation she recognized as a collective asset. The discovery narrowed the field from abstract threat to tangible location. Simultaneously, internal audits confirmed a deeper fracture. One member of her senior security team had authorized the brief power reroute that created the blackout window. The mole had disappeared from the estate minutes after Isaiah vanished, leaving behind a wiped terminal and an untraceable vehicle record. Betrayal had been embedded within her own defenses. Protocol dictated distance. She should deploy contracted operatives, coordinate with federal contacts, negotiate from encrypted safety. Instead, she made a decision that contradicted decades of doctrine. She prepared to go personally, not as a display of bravado, but as acknowledgement that control built on detachment had led to this moment. Protecting Malcolm's brother required more than strategic delegation. For the first time in her adult life, Dr. Althea Vaughn accepted that safeguarding someone else might cost her everything she constructed. She left Vaughn House before dawn, the Atlantic horizon pale with early light. The warehouse loomed against gray water when she arrived, silent and sealed. She instructed her remaining loyal team to hold perimeter distance. Then she stepped forward alone, knowing this choice might be the last decision she ever controlled. The warehouse interior was colder than the Atlantic air outside, its vast concrete floor illuminated by industrial lights that hummed with sterile indifference. Dr. Althea Vaughn walked forward without visible hesitation, her steps echoing in disciplined rhythm. At the far end of the space stood Graham Voss, leader of the Marrow Collective, composed as ever, his tailored coat a quiet signal of power rather than aggression. Between them lay no visible chaos, only tension sharpened by years of concealed ambition. Isaiah Reed sat in a secured chair near a steel column, unharmed but watchful, absorbing the gravity of a situation larger than he had ever imagined. His presence was proof that this was not about violence. It was about leverage. Voss regarded Althea with a measured calm that suggested inevitability rather than confrontation. He spoke of efficiency, of continuity, of safeguarding the empire from sentimental collapse. His tone framed control as responsibility. Then came the revelation she had sensed but never confirmed. Darius Kincaid had not drowned. He had staged his disappearance once he realized the collective was maneuvering to sideline him. He intended to shield his sons from becoming bargaining assets in a system he no longer trusted. For years he remained hidden, redirecting small fragments of equity through silent trusts, waiting for leverage that never came. When the collective demanded surrender of his controlling shares, he refused. His resistance ended quietly, away from headlines. His death reframed as the closing chapter of an old accident. Althea felt the truth settle with devastating clarity. Her refusal to question his disappearance, her decision to preserve the empire rather than pursue suspicion, had created the vacuum the collective exploited. She had convinced herself that survival justified silence. That silence had cost Darius his life. The weight of it stripped away the last remnants of detachment. Voss outlined the offer again: transfer controlling ownership to the collective, secure Isaiah's release, preserve public stability. The structure would remain intact, merely redirected. Althea listened without interruption. Her mind no longer calculated only profit and loss. It measured consequence against conscience. The boys were not abstract heirs. They were living extensions of a partnership she had betrayed through inaction. Instead of signing the prepared digital transfer to the collective, she initiated a parallel sequence through her encrypted tablet. Legal documents drafted the previous night activated instantly. Majority ownership of the hidden infrastructure arm transferred to Malcolm Reed, effective immediately, filed simultaneously through offshore registries and domestic disclosures. The move shattered the collective's leverage. Control no longer rested in her hands to surrender. At the same moment, a data release protocol launched across multiple federal oversight agencies and investigative journalists. Years of archived communications between the Marrow Collective and intermediary shell corporations flooded secure servers. The files documented coercive investment strategies, unauthorized surveillance expansions, and suppressed compliance warnings. The collective's invisibility evaporated in seconds. Outside, sirens began to gather in disciplined formation. Federal authorities, triggered by automated evidence submissions and whistleblower protections embedded in her release, moved to secure the site. The warehouse no longer belonged to quiet negotiation. It belonged to exposure. Isaiah was escorted to safety without resistance. Confusion etched across his face as layers of secrecy collapsed around him. The empire destabilized instantly. Market algorithms flagged irregular transfers. Offshore partners withdrew. News outlets began assembling fragments of a narrative too large to contain neatly. Althea stood in the center of it, aware that dismantling the predictive policing division publicly would send another shockwave through institutions dependent on its analytics. She announced its termination through a direct regulatory filing before anyone could demand it. In surrendering control, she reclaimed something far more fragile: moral alignment. The empire she built to protect herself would not continue at the cost of inherited harm. She sacrificed authority to restore balance, knowing redemption would not erase consequence. As federal agents approached with formal documentation and the press assembled beyond police lines, Althea caught sight of Malcolm arriving with security escort. His expression was unreadable, carrying shock, inheritance, and unresolved grief all at once. The empire was exposed, the collective fractured, Isaiah safe. Yet the cost was unfolding in real time. Investigations would follow. Indictments were possible. Standing in the cold light of accountability, she understood that saving them did not guarantee forgiveness. 6 months later, the Atlantic coastline carried a quieter rhythm. Vaughan House no longer felt like a fortress guarding secrets, but like a structure recovering from exposure. Legal proceedings unfolded in measured hearings, regulatory committees reviewed disclosures, and Dr. Althea Vaughan remained under federal investigation without formal indictment. Her public image had shifted from untouchable strategist to controversial reformer. Commentators debated her motives, some framing her actions as calculated self-preservation, others as overdue accountability. The truth lived somewhere more complicated than either narrative allowed. Malcolm Reed now legally held majority ownership of what remained of the former shadow infrastructure. The transfer had been upheld through layered courts, supported by Darius Kincaid's original contractual clause. Yet ownership no longer meant control in the traditional sense. Under Malcolm's authority, advised by independent ethics boards and restructured compliance teams, the empire had transformed into a technology foundation focused on transparency and equitable data governance. Predictive surveillance contracts were terminated. Algorithms were open for third-party auditing. Profits were redirected into community-based research initiatives. The architecture that once operated in secrecy now functioned under public oversight. Isaiah Reed had enrolled in a private academy outside Baltimore, funded through a trust separate from the foundation's assets. The transition from foster instability to structured education was not seamless, but it was stable. He adapted with quiet resilience, balancing curiosity with guardedness. He visited Vaughan House occasionally, though never under obligation. His presence in the estate's once sterile corridors softened its atmosphere in ways no interior redesign could achieve. Althea adjusted to a life stripped of absolute authority. She met regularly with investigators, submitted documentation, and answered questions about decisions that once felt untouchable. The absence of unchecked control unsettled her at first, like phantom weight after removing armor. Yet beneath the uncertainty, there was unexpected steadiness. She no longer monitored offshore vaults at midnight. She no longer managed invisible leverage. The silence in her office carried less tension and more reflection. One overcast afternoon, she drove alone to a modest cemetery overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. Darius Kincaid's grave marker was understated, inscribed with dates that concealed more than they revealed. She stood before it without audience, without press, without performance. For years she had framed his disappearance as tragic inevitability. Now she confronted it as consequence shaped partly by her own silence. The wind moved through bare branches above her, and she allowed herself the unfamiliar act of acknowledgement. Trust, she understood at last, was risk. But risk was also inheritance. Weeks later, Malcolm arrived at Vaughan House without security coordination. His visit was voluntary, not strategic. He walked through the front doors with the composure that had once mirrored his father's, though it now carried independent weight. The tension between them had not vanished, but it had evolved. He had reviewed foundation reports, implemented governance reforms, and faced boardroom resistance with steady resolve. He did not seek permission. He sought clarity. They spoke in the main study, where the original encrypted servers once stood. Althea presented him with a secured archive drive containing complete transparency records of the former Empire contracts, internal debates, ethical dissent logs, and her own private memos. Nothing was withheld. It was not an attempt to absolve herself, it was an offering of unfiltered truth. Ownership, she had learned, required context as much as capital. Malcolm accepted the archive with quiet gravity. In that exchange lived something fragile yet significant: generational repair, beginning not through denial but disclosure. Isaiah joined them later that evening, his presence less burdened by legacy and more oriented toward possibility. The estate felt less like an inheritance battleground and more like shared ground tentatively rebuilt. As night settled, Malcolm connected the encrypted drive to a secure terminal in the study. Layers of documentation unfolded methodically until he reached a final restricted file labeled only with a timestamp predating even his father's recorded involvement. He initiated decryption expecting closure. Instead, the system flagged an active external access point pinging the same hidden layer in real time. The empire they believed fully exposed contained one remaining architecture neither of them had mapped, and someone else was already inside it. Some stories aren't just about power or money. They're about the choices that define who we become when no one is watching. If this journey made you reflect even for a moment, stay connected to stories that challenge legacy, loyalty, and truth. Share this with someone who believes redemption is still possible, and follow along for narratives that don't end where comfort begins. If you built something powerful to protect yourself from the world, and one day you discovered it quietly harmed the very people you were meant to protect, would you give it all up for redemption, or would you defend what you spent a lifetime creating? Tell me honestly, what would you choose?